how much should you spend on your indie record? And we have a great group of folks joining us today, which I would like you to welcome. And I'll say a couple of words here. They're all people that I have known for a very long time, so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to have a much more formal kind of chat than we ordinarily would have. First is Nesby Phips, who many of you know is a rap artist and record producer, and he's worked with a large number of artists, everybody from Juvenile and Lil Wayne to Trombone Shorty and Aaron Neville. And he is very much an ambassador of New Orleans, and he's been making records for a very long time. So please welcome Nesby Phips. Chris Finney, who is, are you still the only certified Pro Tools instructor in New Orleans?
No, that expired a long time.
Oh, okay. But is a very renowned engineer, record producer, mixer, all-around studio guru who has worked also with an enormous number of artists, both from here and not from here, and is also a leader of the engineers and producers wing of the Recording Academy. Chris Finney, everybody. And next is Brian Seeger, who is probably best known in New Orleans as a wonderful, wonderful jazz guitar player. And I always have thought of him as kind of New Orleans' answer to Pat Metheny. But now that his most recent record is kind of a B3-centric record, I don't know, who's the guitar player that played in great organ trios?
Grant Green.
Okay, so now he's also the Grant Green of New Orleans. But most people don't know that he is a summa cum laude graduate of the Berklee College of Music.
Oh my God.
And also a master of music and jazz performance at the University of New Orleans, where he is also an instructor. So please welcome Brian Seeger. And finally, David W. Alexander Lefty Parker, who is a musician, a disc jockey, record producer, record store manager.
I do a lot of stuff. I'm a producer, I'm a DJ, I didn't send you a bio, did I?
No, but I found one. Would you like me to read it?
Do you have one?
Lefty Parker is the bassist, this is an old one, is the bassist for the Interlopers, who released the first post-Katrina record in the city on Rhinestone Records, and a 4-year member of the Ninth Ward Marching Band. Shall I go on?
Sure.
No, that's all right. Let's get to the panel, shall we? So some of you may know that this conversation started innocently enough from a post on Facebook that I made just asking the question, how much should you spend on your indie record? Which is to say, how much should you spend to make the record? Well, we all kind of remember, for me, it kind of goes back to the mid-'80s when there was this talk of this thing on the horizon called the internet. And the hype at the time was that very, very soon, probably by '87, we would all be making records for free in our bedrooms, and we would bypass the record label system, and there would be no more record labels, and the whole world would become flat, and everybody would have an equal opportunity for success. Well, we've seen how history has played out, and it has not exactly happened that way, and there are still lots of people who go to studios. Studios are still very much in business. We have a couple of relatively new recording studios here in New Orleans that are very high-end, and they stay busy all the time. And there are also people who are making records very credibly much of the time, who are spending little or no money to produce those records. Now, I just want to say off the bat, this panel is not about how much should you charge for your record, or how much should you earn from your record. How much money should you make from it? That's not what this is about. We assume that everybody making records has figured out some kind of a deal that works for them, whether they're giving their music away for free on the internet, or they're putting it up on Spotify, which is essentially the same thing, or they are holding out and insisting on selling the recordings for relatively top dollar however they can, whether it's from the bandstand or from a website or anything else. So the financial transaction part of it is something else. The question for today is, how much does a person need, does a musician, does an artist, does a recording artist need to spend to make their record? So I posed this question on Facebook, and it got about 100 replies with all, the range was just incredible. So let's get right into it. That's enough of me talking. So Nesby, how much do you think an artist, especially a new artist, coming up, wanting to make a record, needs to spend in order to just be in the recording process itself? Let's leave out mastering and replication and all that other stuff. Let's just talk about studio time.
Well, my inner Mr. Weinstein says pay as little as possible. You know, that's just a rule of thumb in business, period, when you're manufacturing anything. In my genre, I started out in hip-hop, definitely moved to digital, and it's very easy. I make music at the red light in my phone nowadays, and it's of good quality. There's so many resources at hand. It really boils down to a preference. Like, I personally couldn't spit out a dollar amount. I would tell you, don't spare expense on mixing, whatever you could pull off, because I know guys that are, you know, if I buy them dinner, you know, pizza, we'll sit around, listen to a record and make it sound as good as we could, and we're good to go. The record's fine. So there is no set number. It would be incorrect for me to give a number. Spend as little as possible to make it as best as possible. Good rule of thumb of business.
All right, well, I'm going to come back to you on that. But right now, I'm going to ask Chris. Now, Chris, you may be in a little bit of a different position than the other guys on the panel, not being a recording artist per se yourself, more of a producer engineer. So I guess we need to take it for granted that you depend upon guys hiring you to be in the studio. Otherwise, you wouldn't make a living, so there's that.
Yeah, my answer would almost be the opposite of Nesby's, where it's like
spend as
much as possible, especially for a guy who makes his living doing this. Right. But I think, you know,
especially on the mixing, yeah. Actually, don't skimp on the mixing, because that's something you specialize in. Right?
Yeah, the one thing that makes a mix better is time, and you know, for a place like a studio or an engineer who works by the hour, time equates to money. So, you know, the short answer is how much you should spend is how long is a piece of string. It's how long do you need it to be, you know, and how much can you afford at the time, you know. And I do think an artist, I generally find that an artist who makes a personal sacrifice financially is a little more committed in the long run. And I'm not accusing crowdsourcing, you know, crowdfunding of damaging that, but I definitely see when the money just comes in free over the internet, the attitude in the studio is different. So I'll add that to the conversation.
Okay. So Brian, you commented very specifically on the little Facebook thread that we had going. And at some point, and you had very specific things to say about budgeting, and I made the joke that it really requires a spreadsheet to keep all this together, and I think you said, I got 1 million of them. So can you just talk from your perspective about what the approach that you take as a recording artist when you are budgeting for a new record? How much do you think that I mean, typically on a project, how much do you set aside?
I mean, one thing that you have to know a little bit is, like, I'm also a producer. I've produced about 25, like, actually released records, and maybe another, you know, 20 that weren't officially, like, released on a label or whatever. So I deal with that a lot. And I would say that I have a few pet peeves, because I feel like that people come up with these dollar amounts that are, like, completely unrealistic. And it's because that there's a lot of, like, expenditures in making products that aren't necessarily dollars. They're like favors, or they're like all your time, or your time in buying your own gear, and the dollars that were invested in that, and the dollars that you invest in, like, learning how to use the stuff and all this kind of thing. So I feel like that it may be true that you could make a record that's really happening for $5,000, but there'll be all these kind of, like, actual costs that weren't like monetary costs. And so that might work for the first record where you can like ask for a bunch of favors or whatever, but it's not going to like work over and over again. So that's one of the things. And it sort of agitates me a little bit when musicians don't like come to terms with what the actual costs are of their products, because I feel like they also don't, kind of what you're saying, that the investment isn't the same because they don't actually, it doesn't feel like the same amount of pain or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I could make a record for free. Except that, you know, I have a friend, a very wise friend, that says free is the most expensive. You know, it's like, yeah, I could make it for free, but I would be begging a bunch of people for favors, and I would just be spending thousands and thousands of hours of my time and everything like that. So that's one thing that I think that everybody has to, I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind that even when you get it, like you have a friend that gives you a deal, like that there's costs involved in that, because like you're going to end up going and like taking care of their cat when they're on vacation or whatever, you know. But I also feel like what Chris says, I think that basically what I would say is you should figure out how much money you're comfortable spending, and then you should decide to spend about twice that much money. Because what I notice a lot out there in the universe is that there's these cats that put these records together on a budget, and they just don't really sound. I mean, like, just to be honest, the playing might be killing and the tunes might be killing, but the records just don't sound that good. And even though, and a lot of people were like, well, people are just listening to it on their iPod speakers and they can't really tell the difference in quality. But the fact is I really do believe that people can. They subconsciously can tell the difference in quality. So even if you put out your really killing tune and the quality just is kind of like a little bit homemade or DIY, that it won't have the same impact in terms of someone feeling like it sounds professional. And then from being out there and dealing with like radio people a lot, the constant complaint I hear is, man, why do people just send me so much garbage? So I feel like in general, it would be better for people to make less records that are better than more records that aren't as good. Now, of course, this really depends on your market, and there's definitely some argument to say you should just release singles and never even think about making a record. And this whole idea about making a whole album is just so old school. So it really depends on what you're operating in. But in the field that I'm operating in jazz, it's maybe an older audience, maybe a little bit more audiophile, maybe a little bit more radio friendly, and it's like people want to hear like really killing sounding albums. So I would say that the dollar amount is somewhere probably, if you're not talking about mastering, which I think also is like an expense that you should think about. I mean, for me, it's somewhere around 15 grand, I would say, is like a number if you're using live musicians. And I think that if you can do it for $5, it just means that either you like trimmed off $5,000 worth of quality and you trimmed off $5,000, you added $5,000 worth of favors. But I think at the end of it all, it's still going to cost somewhere around there if you really want to make something that somebody's going to want to listen to more than once. And that's really important. If you like want to develop a fan base, you got to find the people that are thrilled about your stuff. And if like your stuff is only the quality that they just kind of glancingly listen to one time, they're never going to tell somebody. Nobody's going to get that excited about that to like tell some other friend or just even to remember that they heard it. So that's my feeling.
Okay, well, I think we finally heard a number. I asked a question that was how much should you spend, and everybody talked for about 15 minutes, and Brian finally brought out the $15,000 number. So we have 15 going once, 15 going twice. So, Lefty, on the famous Facebook thread,
I spent $1,000 on my record.
Thank you very much. So can you elaborate a little bit? How did you manage to make a record for so little?
I mean, I don't disagree with you. I probably spent $5,000 in my own time on that record. I probably spent another $1,000 on general gear, but the expense of the gear is now feeding the next album I'm making right now, which has cost me about $500. So when it comes down to it, we do have the technological resources to do this cheaply. Now, when you think about I think it's called the project manager's triangle, which is good versus time and... Yeah, well, time. If you have time, You can really do a lot with that.
A lot of people have more time than they have money.
If you're a struggling musician and you really want this record to come out, you can spend all of your time. My wife hates me for it, but she has heard my records more than anyone else because I play them in the car. I test them all over the world because I don't have the ear or the gear to do it any other way. But I don't have the money to do it any other way either, and I really want these songs to be heard, and I want these records to be made. That being said, my last record was a garage rock record. So I went into the studio. I captured one day for $500. We captured the entire live band. I cut out the parts that I didn't like. I had the band come into my house and re-record the parts that I did like. I mixed it. I went back to the studio and I played the mixes for the guy that was the engineer on my original session. Spent another $500 on sitting there and going, okay, what did I do wrong here? And then
This was in a studio.
that was in a studio. It's
But
in
the
a
part
small
that you
studio.
recorded at home, what kind of gear were you using?
Oh, I bought a really nice Sennheiser Phantom Power mic, and I use a Focusrite. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, and I did it, and I mixed it with my laptop. And sometimes I mixed it in my laptop in my car because I was feeding CDs into my car to make sure that it sounded right. It takes a lot of time to do it that way, and it's not the right way to do it, but you can make an excellent quality product by doing it that way. It's just going to eat up like months of your time.
We're going to get you an auxiliary cord so you can start with those CDs.
But you did say that was a garage rock record, which I think is a consideration.
No, my neighbors think I'm really weird because I sit in my car with my laptop at all hours of the day and night.
But the genre of music also does affect the discussion as to how much one should anticipate, because you might want to spend a different amount of money if it's a string quartet or if it's a jazz group. Sorry?
I would never do that with a jazz album. A jazz album is going to require, I mean, he's right, it's $5,000. At the very minimum for a jazz
Nesby?
album.
Yeah, the genre makes all the difference. It changes the variables of everything, because there's no way I could record an upright bass in my closet. You know, that's just not realistic. But what I do is I'm all digital. I've been doing this for 10 years or better, and I've never hardly ever got a printed copy. Most of the stuff I wasn't even selling it, but I'm still able to monetize on it somewhere. So yeah, like you could pull it off anywhere with my genre, and there's so many genres out here now. So you know, you want to respect what you're doing. So I think that makes a difference as well. You know, how much you got to respect the instrument you're using, the whole nine. You know.
Now, Nesby, when you make records, do you work with live musicians? Or
Yes,
is
I
it-
do.
Okay.
I just did. All right, so I'm a rapper, do most things digitally. I just did a live album with Prospect. He's an engineer as well as a musician. So we had it all in one bag. So it's not like I had to cough up a crazy budget for him to engineer the album, because we did this album together. And again, I guess that's a part of my resources, what you would say. So if you keep things in-house, it helps out a lot. It's almost like running an at-home business, I guess you could say. And that cuts down on things, being DIY. That's the nature of me even existing up here. I found a way to leverage a career on never having a budget, because all my real cash went to my kids. So it was like, let me get a laptop, let me do something with my spare time after work to kind of leverage myself into it. And once I did it, just to kind of turn my straw into gold, I saw that I could repeat the process and still crank out. So why go and grab extra money and spend it like that when it's not necessarily needed, for my genre?
Now, Nesby, you can record basically at home. So you had to have invested a certain amount in the necessary gear to be able to do that. How much do you think you spent in just gear to be able to get?
Gear?
Yeah.
I actually bartered my way into a laptop. I've had 3 laptops. I've been using laptops since Katrina, and I've literally paid no cash for any of them. I bartered. I barter a lot. I'm a barber. I'm a videographer. Sometimes I build websites. I'm a visual artist. I barter a lot, which is just as good as cash, if not better, because I'm also building a relationship, which building a whole nother thing with this individual. But that's a whole rabbit hole of stuff, right? But I bartered my laptop. I bought a mic, same mic I've been using for over 10 years. So what, $200 mic, and I traded in some old equipment to get a new interface to plug that mic into. And I did buy some speakers last week for $150 on Craigslist. So it's like, you know, I'm thrifting my way into a career and have been doing it, and it works. So, you know, I could go and get super pristine, but I'm getting pretty pristine where I'm at right now.
And look at how far you've come. I mean, you're here on a sync-up panel.
That's
I mean,
my third time. It's my third time, you know.
Brian, do you have a studio at home?
I do have a studio at home.
Did you invest a lot of money in the gear that you have?
Yes, I did.
And do you make your own records there?
I mean, in the process of me producing, there is always some point in it that I am doing some sort of overdubbing at my house. And it's often like acoustic instruments that have to sound like really, really happening. So like I might bring in a cello player to put a part down on something, or I might bring in, let's see, I'm thinking of the last record that I did that was kind of like that. I had to bring in an acoustic guitar player, I brought in a clarinet player, I brought in a violinist.
But you prefer to do those at your house?
Well, because it's like in that type of project, it's like there's 10 tracks that have this common element, so then I went to a real studio with like a killing engineer and like got all the fundamentals of it together and like went through a whole pre-pro production situation beforehand, and I could map it out and say, well, we can knock all this out with this core of people, and then all the little individual things I can add on after the fact, and I'll do them in my own studio.
Yeah, we just did a violin at the house, and it came out great because, I mean, it's not ideal, but weird rooms give character sometimes.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And like both of y'all said, I mean, it's very genre dependent, you know? It's like,
that's an important point.
It's like if you know, like if you take a vocal and you put it in the genre that you're dealing with is like that really hard-edged auto-tune situation, you don't necessarily need a $10,000 Sony mic through a Neve console with a vintage 1176. But if you're trying to sound like Alison Krauss, you ain't going to do it on a $200 mic with a $100 signal path. It just is not going to happen, period. I don't care what magazine you read that says it's going to happen. They're lying to you. Trust me.
I think Chris was on the cover of that magazine.
Buy more gear.
Chris, what's the largest recording budget you've ever been involved with on a record? Just for that record.
I think they didn't plan for this ahead of time, but in the end, it was close to $600,000.
Some people have more money than sense.
It's like house renovations. Once you pull those walls back and you see you got to turn
Yeah,
right
exactly. Well, it became a double album pretty rapidly.
Oh, of course, and then a concept album on top of it. And what is the lowest budget that you've ever worked with on a record?
$200 for a, you know, to just kind of illustrate what we've talked about, like the genre specific aspect of it. The majority of what I record is bands and usually performance oriented groups of musicians. So a huge part of the workload for my task is pre-production, making sure it's like rehearsing a play or a movie. You rehearse it until everybody's second nature about it. Then when you actually are spending money in the studio, you're simply taking a picture of this performance that has been refined and refined and refined.
Otherwise, the budget balloons to $600,000.
Yeah, exactly, very quickly. Well, within 7 months. But the more you do pre-production and the more you practice what's going to happen, you can make those minutiae decisions before the clock is running. And so just I kind of consider that as just part of your diligence as a producer in that situation.
Pre-production meaning rehearsal.
Rehearsal primarily, and the great thing about having an iPhone is everybody in the band has an iPhone, and you tell them put it all on voice record, voice memo, and just keep your iPhone close to you by your instrument. Then at the end of that rehearsal, I'll take everybody's sound file, I'll have them email it to me or something, and I'll line them up, find a snare hit or something, line them up in the computer, and now I've got basically a multi-track recording that was made with 4, 5, 6 iPhones, And it's enough for me to start visualizing the sonic aspect of it. How do I want this to sound? What parts of this can I record in a house with a $200 microphone? And what parts of this do I need, my $20,000 Neumann in a pristine acoustic space?
How does that cut down on post time?
I think it makes all the difference in the world. It's like aiming a telescope. The smaller move you make at the beginning is a big move at the end.
Right.
So the more you can think it through and just be committed to what you're going to do. I come from the school of records where you kind of commit to. It's about making a commitment, whether it's the perfect thing or not. The Beatles committed. They had to. They didn't have the resources to do it over and over again.
Right.
So that, to me, that adds a character to it, is being ready to commit. And the only way you can really be confident to commit is to have rehearsed it and to have answered a lot of those questions that would otherwise waste time.
I would point out on my $1,000 garage rock record, the way we paid for that record was I set up 2 months of weekly gigs at Saturn Bar, which were 8 gigs, and we gigged every week, same way, and I recorded those with my Zoom every time, and we made about $200 a night, and each gig led up to what we would be able to pay for the recording time with, and we also had the rehearsals for the record at the same time. So there's a way to do this that does end up being cost effective for you if that's your situation. But I also know people that have gone in and recorded an entire orchestra one piece at a time at their house. So
absolutely. I worked with a guy who he hired a huge band. It was basically a big band record, but there's a section of it where he wanted to play solo piano. And we were literally in the studio with a 30-piece jazz orchestra while this guy played solo piano. And it was like, dude, we can do this anytime. You don't need to be paying all these musicians to watch you play piano. But, it was his money.
I'm hoping that there are some folks that may have questions in the audience. If you do, we have a microphone that we would ask you to use. And so I'm going to open it up to questions starting right now. So if anybody has a question, please feel free. If not, I'll just keep pinging these guys with nasty anecdotes as long as I can. You all have studios in your house?
Yes, pre-production studio.
Mixing and editing mainly. I can do overdubs as well, but not primarily.
So at what point do you we've talked about this a little bit, but let's just amplify a little bit more. At what point do you make the decision that, okay, I can't handle this part at the house. Now we have to go and start the clock.
It's like a grocery list. When you run out of mayonnaise, you go to the store and get more. Like, as soon as I see, all right, I can't do this myself, I call my engineer friend. Sometimes I'll pay the $50 for a quick hour. Look, I just need this one note played 4 times right. You know what I'm saying? And it'll be worth it.
Now, many folks know that, well, certainly in the New Orleans market, and I assume that this is true in other places as well, there is a wide range of professional quality recording studios that are available to people. There are the very small project studios that may be located in somebody's house, say, that they've converted into a pretty decent recording.
Where I recorded mine, Tom Stern's Blue Flame Studio. My answer to that question is when drums are involved.
When drums
I would rather record drums I'd rather pay somebody to record drums in a studio than me try and do them anywhere else, really. Drums are very tricky to
Is that
get
because
right.
your neighbors don't want to hear them, or
no? They're really hard to mic. I mean, unless you're in a studio environment with a room that's built to deal with drums and microphones that are built to
it's like 4 or more mics on one
thing.
instrument. Like, you know what I'm saying? That's a lot.
What'd you say, Nesby?
There's so much that goes into just getting drums with the mic set up, routing it, the whole nine. I could understand that totally. But I'm digital.
I would think, I mean, the line for me builds off of what Brian was saying, where there's one rule in recording, and that you can't separate sound from space. After that, there are no rules. Ask Les Paul, ask Tom Dowd, there are no rules, except that you cannot separate sound from space. So if you have a sound that's required of a space, or a space that complements a sound in a certain way, then there is no choice. The upright bass is a great example. You can't record that just anywhere. There's so many.
Same for pianos.
Yeah, piano is, I think it's like drawing hands. It's a very subtle thing that if you get it wrong, everybody knows it's wrong. But if you get it right, nobody thinks, oh, that's a great piano recording, you know. But to get it right, you need an amazing instrument, an amazing player, in an amazing space. And then the microphones are actually pretty low down on the list. It's more about the sound of the instrument, which speaks to the player, and then the sound of the space, which is, it's a marriage between the two. So
Just ask Cosimo.
yeah, right, exactly. It's about the player.
Cosimo had what, 3 knobs and 2 mics?
So if you were to encounter a young, Brian, you still teach at a university, so you're encountering young musicians on a daily basis. But to all of you, when you meet young musicians who are first starting out and they're asking your advice on how to approach your recording, what do you tell them? Especially if the question comes up, how much should I expect to spend on this record?
I think that I'm gonna keep going back to the same thing. Like when you say that you did 8 gigs and you put all the money into the pot, to me that's a $3,200 expense if you had a 4-piece band. And I kind of, it bugs me to not calculate it that way. If cats are putting their time, because you're gonna owe them. Like they're gonna come back to you at some point, and you're gonna have to do the same thing, 8 gigs for free for somebody, probably. Don't you think? Well, yeah.
They are equal recipients of the
This was like
result
an equity
of the
partner.
product.
Yeah,
This is a band environment, and
Right.
it's not actually something that happens that often today. But everyone put in their own investment, and we only made, it's not $200 a man, it's $200 a gig.
Right.
But,
So everybody decided,
So we
guys,
could all walk away with $20, or we can end up with a record that we want. So yeah, we are all essentially paying for it, but it's still a group collectively $1,000.
Right. No, and I dig, and my organ trio is
Yeah.
the same way. I mean, they're not straight up. They're not straight up charging me, but when I'm thinking of the costs, or I'm writing a grant, or I'm imagining it in my mind, or if I'm thinking of the situation, I know what they would. I know what, if they were side people, that's what they would charge, and it's like, and I'm like aware of that as a price point. I think that that's important for everybody for a lot of reasons, but I would get back to what I said. I think that if I was given a student advice, I would say figure out how much money you are comfortable with and double it, because you're not going to have too much money at the end, trust me. And if you do, then you'll pay for some promotion or whatever, which actually is super critical, even though you said we're not going to talk about that. But I think that there's a buy-in. There's like a buy-in about deciding to really like chunk it down. It means that maybe you'll spend more time ahead of time making sure that your tune really has a hook, or that the structure is really happening, or there's a buy-in where you'll be like, you'll decide how much you're gonna make other people rehearse stuff, or that you're gonna more prepare ahead of time, or you're going to have the sounds that you want more dialed in your brain, and like that there's going to be like that there'll just be more I just think it brings more focus to it. And I also think that it helps you answer the question about how serious am I about this, because it's a long game, man, and it's like and no matter how and no matter where you get, I mean, probably in any place in life, there's very few people that just get to this point where it's like, oh, I have everything I need, you know. So, but with the music thing, man, it's like, honestly, I mean, I would never have chosen another life, but I'm not going to say it's not like there's a certain beatdown aspect, like pretty much at least almost every day or every other day, right? And so this in going into this process, especially with you're making your first record, yeah, I feel like you should set the bar like higher, because it's going to it's going to help you self-filter whether you actually have what it's going to take to stay in the game. And it's like you're going to need more than one record to stay in the game. And I think that it also means, like, you know, if you say you're comfortable with spending $3,000, but so now you're going to take my advice and find $6,000. Where's the other $3,000? Who else is excited about your project? Who else is going to fund a grant for you? You know, who else are you going to get people to go play gigs for you for free so you can put the money in the kitty? All those kind of things I think are like important to the process.
Yeah, I would think the short answer, you know, the idea of a student or a young person coming to me and saying how much to get into this ring, I think, and it goes back to your first question, it's about $1,000 a song, if you want to think of it that way. That's not paying the musicians, that's just simply for the producer, the engineering process to deliver a finished mix. My first mentor taught me about producing, taught me that the first role of a producer is to turn the money or the resources into a record. So if it means you have to do more of that yourself, if it means knuckling down on the laptop and doing the job that you wouldn't have otherwise wanted to do because you don't have the money to pay for it, or if it means we only have this much money, I have to spend it on the actual studio, and that, again, it comes back on me to do more editing or mixing. Your first role is to put the value. It's why producers get points in the first place, is to increase the value that they're willing to put into it to become like an equity partner in that sense, where I'm putting extra effort beyond the hours for dollars trade so that the quality of this thing is beyond. And you work by the clock long enough and you get sick of it and you decide, you know what, I'm going to set this price at $1,000 because I know I can pay for the studio, and that way I don't have anybody over my shoulder about how long it's taking. I can work to a level of quality rather than a deadline.
So a per project budget rather than an hourly budget.
Yeah, exactly. You try to make it like a vending machine, and you say, here's the choices, and you simplify it. I think that's another role of a producer, is to simplify the number of choices for your artist. And just say, here's, you know, yes, there's 50 ways we could mic this guitar amp. Right. But here's 3. Let's pick from these 3. And if none of those satisfy, here's 3 more. But the point is, I'm reducing the number of options. And the same way a vending machine would. So if I can say $1,000 a song or $10,000 and I'll do 12 songs. Now you see the value increase that comes from making it a package. Right. If you're the person paying for it.
That's where the work engineers put into these albums. That's, you guys should get royalties. That's why. Like, it makes the album. It makes the album. It might be off topic, but it makes the album.
All right, any questions from the audience? Anybody? Anybody? Going once? No? Okay.
I have one other thing to add, actually.
Okay.
So, because you asked about my students, and one thing that I'm really, really a strong believer in, and I would encourage every single person in this room, if you're making your own records, learn how to edit. This is something that you all can do. You can get a $99 a year Pro Tools subscription, and you can edit your stuff as good as anyone ever would edit it anywhere with like a cheap pair of headphones. And it's like you will save a ton of money, and like and you will enact things that you probably would never have the patience or to stand over an engineer's shoulder and try to describe to them, or they wouldn't have the patience to like follow through with it. So I'm like,
give an example. So just in case some people might miss what you're saying about editing prior to going to the studio.
I guess well, no, I'm talking about editing. I'm talking about when you get the tracks from the studio, like editing it. Like if like the bass player like is not lining up with the kick drum, right. Do not pay someone to do that when you can do that yourself. That's what I want you to spell out. Can like you can totally like sit there.
And you do that on your own records?
I do all the editing. I do all the editing, and I've taught a lot of people how to edit, and I've actually, as I was a production consultant on a record a while ago, and I said, look, I can't do all this. I don't have the time. What I have the time for is I'm going to teach you how to do this, and you're going to do all the editing. And if you get to like some edit that's like, because I'm very, very good at editing now, if you get to some edit that's extremely difficult, then I will make the edit for you. Like if it's some crazy like intercutting of 2 different takes and you just can't figure out how to make the drums sound real, I will make that happen for you. But all the rest of the editing you do yourself. And it was great. I totally empowered this person. And they probably spent 4 times longer doing the editing than I would have spent doing it, but they got it done and didn't have to put cash out for it.
But to get to your earlier point, they have to put. You're suggesting that people should put a dollar value on their own time.
Absolutely, 100%.
So if that person is charging themselves $50 an hour and they spend, $100.
No, because if they're an amateur editor, they only should get about $10 an hour, dig. Like I get $50 an hour and I can do it 5 times faster and probably still twice as good, So yeah, and if she spent 200 hours editing, yeah, that's another $2,000 of her time, because she could have taken those same 200 hours and booked gigs, right? Or she could have taken the same 200 hours and did promo for herself. You know what I mean? I don't like this idea that everyone has a bunch of free time when there's an infinite amount of stuff to do to your career in the DIY world. Like just the social media alone, you could just spend like your whole life doing that, right?
Tell me about
it. So it's like, so no, there's no, I mean, people have free time. that exists anymore? I don't know. Not for
if they
me.
have kids.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yeah.
Okay, but well, so you're actually making both points because you're saying that people can, if they have the available time, spend their own time working on their own technology, on their own equipment to do the work on their own recording and avoid spending that money in a proper studio paying somebody else to do it. But they should recognize that their own time has a value and they should understand that even if they don't have to shell out cash for it.
Yeah, if I put 200 hours into something, that's 200 hours I didn't put into something else.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, that's reality. And I think that it bugs me because I feel like sometimes, I had this person that I was working with, an artist, and they did a social media campaign, and they were asking for what I thought was a very reasonable amount of bread for the type of record that they were going to make, and they did end up making a killing sounding record, right? And like we had trolls like, I can't believe you're asking for this much money for this thing, and it's like, why? And it's just like I feel like there's this artifice.
You mean on a crowdfunding?
Yeah, but I feel like there's art. Like I feel like that when artists don't like recognize that really this record did cost me $10,000. Yeah, I only spent $1,000, but I spent $9,000 worth of time that I could have like raised my children or did social media or went on tour or whatever.
Speaking of time, we are running out of our available time, so let me just get back right quick to this infamous Facebook thread. So I asked the question, how much should you spend on your indie record? And the keyboard player John Groh said the exact same thing that you said, Brian, as much as you can afford and then double it to make it properly. But then I asked him to be more specific. Are you talking about $3,000, $10,000, $30,000? And he later in the thread said that I spend about $30,000 on a record. Another musician who we know chimed in saying $5,000 rather. Another musician, I'm not going to call their names, but they're all well known in New Orleans anyway, says at least $3,000. A musician who we also know said, my records tend to run between $15,000 and $25,000. Another guitar player said that for an indie record that sounds like a major label album, expect to spend $8,000 to $10,000. Brian Seeger says, tracking 2 to 3 days, spend $2,000 to $3,000. Mixing $250 to $500 for a tune. So as we can see, there's definitely a range here. Some people saying in the $3,000 to $5,000 range. Some people saying in the $15,000 to $20,000 to $30,000 range. So as we get ready to wrap up this panel, I'm just going to ask you guys one more time the same thing that I asked at the beginning. How much do you think is a reasonable amount of money to spend on a record, regardless of whether you're going to recoup on it, just because you think it's a record that you need to have? Nesby, how much do you think is a reasonable budget for a recording?
Depending on genre, and I come from a hip hop genre, if I had to throw out a number, I'd say $5,000.
Chris, new band, young band, not major label artist, not established artist.
Yeah, I would still stick to that $1,000 a song.
Okay. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I can see that around, I maybe around 10 in actual cash or 6 in actual cash, possibly. You could pull it off. And it really depends on genre, and it really depends on what you're trying to get at the end.
Lefty, anything to add?
First off, I'm an artist. So, I'm a painter, and I spend a lot of time on my paintings at home, and I don't really care what time it takes to do it. And I think that my record is, if it takes all the time in the world, it's the most important thing to me. And for that, to that end, yeah, somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, maybe $5,000 a song, I'm not sure. But I have spent my life trying to learn how to do all these things. Mm-hmm. And I think that I can polish and polish and polish and make what I need to make. And I think I can do it for cheaply. I think I can do it for $1,000. And Pro Tools costs practically nothing at this point. Focusrites cost practically nothing. Mics, decent mics that sound good, cost practically nothing at this point. I think you can do it for cheaper. I don't disagree with what these guys say about the projects that they're talking about, but I do think that a young band, get a 4-track and learn how to use it.
I was just about to say 4-track. The Beatles and them was using 4 tracks, drum, lead, bass, keys, boom.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with Cosmo. Cosmo did this, recorded the greatest music in the history of all time with 2 mics.
And that, for that reason, I never go in too deep with spending money because I know it doesn't take much to get something good. You know what I'm saying?
Lefty, just out of curiosity, how much does it cost you to paint a painting?
How much does it cost me in time?
No, in money.
Oh, in money? Practically nothing.
So to your point, so some people, as we said, have more time available than they have money in order to pay for these things.
And desire.
Real quick, before we wrap this up, and I'm sorry that we are out of time, but we have more panels coming up. Are any of you, do you have any experience using the sound recording tax credit that is available here in Louisiana? And I think this may be the only state in the country that has a sound recording tax credit. Thumbs up, thumbs down on the program.
I haven't used it.
Okay.
I'm on the edge because with a $5,000 threshold and you get back 25%, you have to turn in the paperwork with an audit. That audit might cost you $1,000.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
At $5,000, you hit the threshold, you pay for the audit, you get $1,000 back. It's a zero-sum game. So unless you're making a record that costs $10,000, $15,000, it kind of becomes less and less worth it to use the tax credit.
Brian?
Yeah, exactly. It's onerous. It's onerous if exactly for that reason. If your actual, and it also, it's like if you pay any people that don't live in Louisiana, you can't expense them against the thing. So basically, it's only against the actual cash that you spend in Louisiana, and you have to pay an auditor $1,000, and then you have to jump through all kinds of hoops, and it's not free money.
I don't think it should go away, for the record.
No, yeah, I agree. No, what I think is that I would love it if the Jazz and Heritage Foundation figured out how to pay an auditor to deal with these things for us, and then we would recoup some actual bread.
We have a grant for that. You've already applied for it.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's about all the time that we have for this panel. So everybody, please thank these wonderful gentlemen for their time and their knowledge. Nesby Phips, Chris Finney, Brian Seeger, and Lefty Parker. All right, thank you guys so much for doing this. I appreciate it. I will see you on Facebook, if not sooner.